today with a message of hope, restoration, and the incredible power of divine intervention. The title of my speech may be simple: God is restoring every lost opportunity in your life. But behind this phrase is a deep truth that can shape the course of our lives if we embrace it, believe it, and walk in its power. In life, we all face moments of loss. Some are small and fleeting, like missing a job opportunity or letting go of a fleeting dream. Others can be deeply painful and transformative, like the loss of a loved one, a relationship, or a part of ourselves we thought we would never lose. We all have moments when we feel like time has passed us by, when we have missed the mark, or when we wonder whether we'll ever have another chance at success or happiness. But I am here to tell you today without any shadow of doubt that God is in the business of restoration. He is not just a God who allows us to go through seasons of loss and struggle. He is a God who brings beauty from ashes, who makes a way where there seems to be no way. He specializes in turning the most painful situations into platforms for His glory. And one of the ways He does that is through restoring lost opportunities. To understand this more clearly, we must first grasp the idea of opportunity itself. What does it mean to have an opportunity? Opportunity is, in its most basic form, a moment in time when we can seize something of value. It's the time when paths cross, when our skills meet the right circumstances, and when doors swing open that allow us to step into something new, something better, something that can change the course of our lives. But what happens when we miss an opportunity? It's easy to think that once a door is closed, it's closed forever. We might feel discouraged, defeated, or even trapped in the limitations of our own mistakes or circumstances. Maybe we missed a business deal, a relationship opportunity, or a chance for personal growth. Maybe we were too late, too slow, too uncertain, or too afraid to take the risk. The sting of a missed opportunity is real. It can feel like a weight on your shoulders, and at times, it might make you wonder if you'll ever be able to recover from it. But I want to remind you today that God does not operate in the same way that we do. While we may view missed opportunities as final, God views them as chances for divine intervention. You see, God is not bound by time, and He is not bound by our mistakes. He is the God who restores, who redeems, and who makes all things new. Where we see a closed door, He sees a window of grace. Where we see failure, He sees the seeds for success. Where we see despair, He sees hope. There is a powerful story in the Bible that illustrates this divine restoration perfectly. It is the story of Joseph. Joseph was a man who, by all human standards, experienced one lost opportunity after another. He was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. Joseph could have easily seen all these events as the end of his story. He could have given up on his dreams, become bitter, or resigned himself to a life of mediocrity. But he didn't. Instead, Joseph trusted in God's sovereignty and His plan for his life. He understood that even when things didn't make sense, God was still in control, and in the end, what happened? God restored every lost opportunity that Joseph had endured. Joseph went from the pit of despair to the palace of power. The same brothers who had betrayed him came to him seeking help during a time of famine, and Joseph, in his mercy and wisdom, was able to provide for them and for the nation of Egypt. Joseph's story reminds us that what we might see as lost, God can still use for His purposes. What we might think is a setback, God can turn into a setup for something greater. Even when we make mistakes or face rejection, we can trust that God has not abandoned us. If we remain faithful, keep our hearts open to His leading, and allow Him to work in our lives, He will restore every lost opportunity in His perfect timing. It's important to understand that restoration doesn't always look like we expect it to. We often think that when God restores an opportunity, He will simply bring back the exact thing we lost. But God's restoration is often far greater than we can imagine. He doesn't just restore the opportunity, He refines us in the process. He prepares us for something better, something more in line with His divine purpose for our lives. This is where many of us get frustrated. We want restoration on our terms. We want things to go back to the way they were. But God knows that if He restored everything the way we wanted, it might not lead to the future He has planned for us. Sometimes restoration requires growth. It requires us to go through a process of healing, learning, and becoming stronger. This process can be painful, but it is always purposeful. Consider the story of Ruth, another woman in the Bible, who experienced the restoration of lost opportunities. Ruth was a widow who had lost her husband and moved to a foreign land with her mother-in-law. She could have been consumed by bitterness or hopelessness, but instead she chose to work hard, trust in God, and follow His leading. As a result, God restored her in the most beautiful way. Not only did she meet Boaz, a man who had become her husband, but she also became part of the lineage of Jesus Christ. The restoration of her lost opportunities brought forth a legacy of redemption and hope for generations to come. In both Joseph's and Ruth's stories, we see that restoration doesn't always come immediately. It takes time. It requires patience. But God's timing is always perfect. We may not understand why certain doors close or why certain opportunities seem to slip away, but we can trust that God is working behind the scenes to restore and even redeem the things we've lost. But let's get practical for a moment. How do we begin to see this restoration in our own lives? The first step is to stop viewing ourselves as victims of lost opportunities. If you find yourself lamenting over what could have been or what you should have done differently, you're missing the truth of God's redemptive power. Your life is not defined by missed opportunities. It's defined by the grace of God that is available to you right now. The second step is to align your heart with God's will. This means letting go of your own agenda and trusting that He knows what's best for you. The Apostle Paul writes in Romans 8:28 that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. This doesn't mean that everything will be easy or painless, but it does mean that no matter what we face, God is working behind the scenes to bring about something good. When we trust Him, we can be confident that He will restore every lost opportunity in a way that is far greater than we could have imagined. The third step is to remain faithful even in the face of disappointment. Restoration often comes through persistence. It comes when we continue to move forward even when we can't see the full picture. Joseph didn't know how his story would end. Ruth didn't know what God had in store for her, but they kept going. They kept trusting. And in the end, God restored everything that was lost and more. Lastly, we must remember that restoration is not just about regaining lost opportunities. It's about becoming who God has called us to be. The process of restoration is not just about what we gain, but also about who we become. As God restores us, He shapes us, refines us, and draws us closer to Himself. In this process, we not only experience the joy of seeing lost opportunities restored, but also the peace of knowing that we are becoming the people God has created us to be. In conclusion, I want to remind you of this. No matter what you've lost, no matter how many opportunities you think you've missed, God is still in control. He is still working in your life. He is still restoring, redeeming, and making all things new. Trust in His timing, trust in His process, and most importantly, trust in His heart for you. He is restoring every lost opportunity, and He will do so in a way that far exceeds anything you could ever dream or imagine. So, don't give up. Keep moving forward. Your restoration is coming, and it's going to be greater than you ever thought possible. God is on your side, and He is restoring every lost opportunity in your life. God is not simply a passive observer of our lives, watching as we face trials, struggles, and heartache. He is not indifferent to our pain or unaffected by our setbacks. In fact, God's very nature is to restore, to redeem, and to bring about something good from the ashes of our loss. This is the heart of the gospel, a God who enters into our pain, who doesn't leave us alone in our brokenness, and who promises to make all things work together for good. Throughout the Bible, we see this theme of restoration woven through the stories of God's people. We see it in the life of Job, a man who lost everything, his wealth, his health, and his family, but who, in the end, received double the blessings he had before. We see it in the story of the Israelites who were enslaved in Egypt for hundreds of years, yet God miraculously brought them out, restoring their dignity, freedom, and their identity as his people. We see it in the life of David, a man after God's own heart, who experienced personal failure, sin, and betrayal, but was ultimately restored by God's grace to be the King of Israel. In these stories and in our own lives, we can see a pattern. God's restoration is not just about bringing back what was lost. It's not just about undoing the bad or replacing what was taken. His restoration is a deep, transformative work that goes beyond simple replacement. He doesn't just take us back to where we were. He moves us forward to a better place. Where we see loss, God sees an opportunity to demonstrate his power and love in ways that we might never have expected. For instance, we might experience a season of failure in our careers, a broken relationship, or a missed opportunity. When these things happen, it's easy to think that the door has been permanently closed, that there is no going back, and that all hope is lost. But that's where God's restoration power comes in. When one door closes, God doesn't just leave us standing in the hallway. He opens another door, one that may lead us to a place even more fulfilling, even more in line with his divine plan for our lives. God specializes in turning setbacks into setups. A setback is a moment where everything seems to be going wrong, when things feel out of control, and when we're left wondering if we've missed our chance. But God specializes in turning those moments around, using them to prepare us for something greater than we ever thought possible. Just like a seed planted in the ground, buried and hidden for a time, our moments of loss and struggle are often the very things that God uses to produce growth, new life, and restoration. In the natural world, many of the most beautiful things come from brokenness. Think about how a pearl is formed. It starts with an irritation or injury to the oyster, which responds by coating the irritation with layers of material to protect itself. Over time, this process results in the creation of a pearl, a thing of great value. The same principle applies to our lives. The things that hurt us, the things that cause us pain and frustration, are the very places where God works to bring about something precious. Our brokenness, when surrendered to him, becomes the fertile soil for restoration and renewal. We see this truth exemplified in the life of Jesus. Jesus, the Son of God, came into the world to restore what was lost in the fall of mankind. He lived a perfect life, but he didn't avoid suffering or loss. He faced rejection, betrayal, and even death on a cross. But through that suffering, he brought about the ultimate restoration, the restoration of humanity's relationship with God. Jesus' death was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that offered forgiveness, healing, and new life to all who would believe in him. When we understand that God specializes in restoration, it changes the way we approach life's difficulties. Instead of seeing our struggles as signs that we've been abandoned or that we've missed our chance, we begin to see them as opportunities for God's redemptive work. Our trials and failures no longer define us. They become the places where God does his best work. Consider the words of the prophet Joel, who spoke to a nation that had experienced devastation. I will restore to you the years that the locust has eaten, Joel 2:25. In this passage, God promises to restore the lost years, the wasted years, and the seasons of devastation. He doesn't just promise to return things to normal. He promises to bring something even better, something greater, something more fruitful. This is the kind of restoration God offers, a restoration that brings about abundance and blessing. But in order to experience this restoration, we must trust in God's ability to work in the midst of our circumstances. We must allow ourselves to believe that He is capable of turning our losses into something far better than we ever imagined. This doesn't mean we will never face difficulty again. It doesn't mean that we won't experience more loss or struggle, but it does mean that no matter what happens, we can rest in the assurance that God's restorative power is greater than any loss we may experience. We must also recognize that God's restoration process is not always immediate. Just like the process of growing a plant or building a house, restoration takes time. There may be seasons where we don't see any visible change, where the pain of the loss still feels fresh. But in those moments, God is working behind the scenes, preparing us for what's to come. His restoration may come in ways we didn't expect, and it may take longer than we thought, but we can trust that He is always working to bring about good in our lives. The restoration that God offers is not just a return to what was lost. It is an invitation to experience something deeper, something more profound, and something more glorious. He is not a God who merely fixes what's broken. He is a God who transforms our lives, who makes all things new, and who uses our pain to shape us into the people He has always intended for us to be. So, when you face loss or setback, don't lose heart. God is not finished with you yet. He specializes in taking what is broken and making it whole. He specializes in turning loss into gain, and He will restore every lost opportunity in ways that will amaze you. God is the master of restoration, and He is always working to bring about something greater in your life. Opportunities are often seen as mere chances or random events that happen to us, but in reality, they are much more than that. They are divine moments, carefully orchestrated by God, where everything we are, our skills, talents, experiences, and even our failures, intersects with the perfect timing of the universe. These moments are not the result of blind luck or coincidence, but are acts of God's providence, where His plan for our lives aligns with the paths we walk. Each of us is given unique gifts, abilities, and experiences that shape us into who we are. These qualities are not random. They are part of God's greater plan for our lives. When we step into opportunities that align with who we are, we begin to see the fullness of His purpose unfold. God doesn't just drop opportunities into our lives haphazardly. He arranges them so that we can fulfill the calling He has placed on our hearts. However, life is not always as simple as walking into the opportunities God has for us. Sometimes we miss them. We might fail to recognize them, hesitate because of fear, or let doubt keep us from taking action. At other times, we might feel unprepared or not good enough for the opportunity when it arises, leading us to miss the chance altogether. The regret of missed opportunities can be overwhelming, and we might even start to believe that the window for success is closed for us. We might question whether we'll ever get another shot at the things we've hoped for. Yet God's plan is bigger than our mistakes. Even when we miss an opportunity or feel like we've squandered our chances, God is not bound by our errors. His timing is perfect, and His grace covers our shortcomings. What may appear to us as a lost opportunity is, in fact, an invitation to trust that God will bring about something better in His time. He doesn't just restore what we've lost. He often replaces it with something far better, something more aligned with His perfect plan for us. Think of the story of Moses. Moses was born into a time when the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, and as a child he was placed in a basket and set afloat on the Nile River to escape Pharaoh's decree that all male Hebrew infants be killed. Moses grew up as an adopted son in Pharaoh's house, but after a series of events, he fled to the desert after killing an Egyptian. In this moment, Moses might have thought his opportunity for greatness was over. He was hiding in the wilderness, a man on the run, far from the people he was supposed to lead. But God had a divine appointment waiting for him in the desert. The burning bush was not just an accident or a random event. It was a moment of divine timing. God met Moses exactly where he was and gave him a new opportunity to fulfill his purpose. What Moses had thought was a wasted time, a time of exile and isolation, was actually a period of preparation for the greatest calling of his life, to lead the Israelites out of Egypt and into freedom. What seemed like a missed opportunity was in reality God's divine plan unfolding in perfect timing. Similarly, we see the story of David. As a young shepherd boy, David was overlooked by his own family when the prophet Samuel came to anoint a new king for Israel. David wasn't even invited to the feast. His father thought he wasn't important enough to be considered, but God had a different plan. David was chosen not because of his outward appearance, but because of his heart. The moment when David was anointed king was not a random moment. It was a divinely orchestrated opportunity that God had set aside for him. David's life didn't immediately take the course he expected, but through many trials, he ultimately became the king of Israel, a man after God's own heart. Just like Moses and David, we too can sometimes miss opportunities because we don't recognize them, we're afraid to step out, or we think we are unqualified. But the beauty of God's divine timing is that even when we miss an opportunity, He is not finished with us. He can bring us to the right moment at the right time. What might feel like a setback or a disappointment can often be the setup for something greater that God has planned. Sometimes, the delay in an opportunity can actually be a blessing. When things don't happen according to our timeline, it doesn't mean that the opportunity has passed us by. It might mean that God is preparing us for what is to come. There is a process in divine timing, a waiting period where God molds us and refines us so that we are ready when the opportunity does arrive. Waiting is not always easy, but it is during the waiting that we learn to trust God more deeply. We learn patience, resilience, and faith that His timing is better than our own. In many ways, the delays we face are actually part of God's preparation process. He is allowing us to grow and mature in the areas that we need in order to fully embrace the opportunity when it comes. We are being positioned for success even when we can't see it in the moment. Our job is to remain faithful, to continue moving forward even when we don't understand why things aren't happening as quickly as we'd like. God's opportunities don't just come when we feel ready. In fact, they often come when we least expect them. It is in those moments that our trust in God is tested. Will we take that leap of faith even if we don't feel fully equipped? Will we trust that God has a purpose, even when the path ahead is unclear? Take the example of Esther. A young Jewish woman, Esther was thrust into the position of queen, and when the time came to speak up for her people, she had to make a decision. She could have stayed silent, but God's timing was in place. She had been placed in the palace for such a time as this. Her position and her influence were part of God's divine plan to save her people. What seemed like a coincidence, Esther becoming queen, was actually a divine opportunity orchestrated by God. She stepped into it, even though it required great courage and sacrifice. And through her obedience, she played a key role in saving an entire nation. In the same way, we are all called to step into the opportunities that God places before us, even when they don't come at the perfect time by our standards. God's timing is always perfect. His opportunities come not when we feel ready, but when He has prepared us to fulfill the purpose He has designed for us. In conclusion, the opportunities we encounter are not random or coincidental. They are part of God's perfect timing, and they are designed to align with His greater plan for our lives. Even if we miss an opportunity or feel unprepared, God can redeem those moments and give us better opportunities in His perfect timing. We may not always recognize divine moments when they come, but if we trust God and remain faithful, we will step into the moments He has prepared for us. Trusting in God's sovereignty is one of the most profound and transformative aspects of faith. It's easy to trust God when everything is going according to plan, when the road ahead is smooth and the path clear. But the true test of trust comes when life takes unexpected turns, when we find ourselves in situations that seem unfair, unjust, or downright hopeless. In these moments, we must choose to believe that God is in control, even when it feels like everything is falling apart. Joseph's story in the Bible is a powerful testament to the importance of trusting in God's sovereignty, especially during times of suffering and uncertainty. Joseph's life offers a remarkable example of how God can work through difficult and painful circumstances to bring about his greater purpose. As a young boy, Joseph was favored by his father Jacob, and this favoritism caused jealousy and bitterness in his brothers. One day, when Joseph went to check on his brothers who were tending the sheep, they seized the opportunity to betray him. They threw him into a pit, intending to leave him to die, but instead they sold him into slavery. Joseph was taken to Egypt, far from his family and everything he knew. At first glance, this appears to be a complete disaster. Joseph's life seemed to be ruined. He was betrayed by his brothers, torn away from his home, and sold into slavery. If anyone had reason to doubt God's goodness and question his sovereignty, it was Joseph. But throughout this series of painful events, Joseph maintained his trust in God. Despite his circumstances, he chose to believe that God was still in control, even when his life seemed to be spiraling out of his hands. Joseph's journey continued with more heartache. He served in the household of Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, where he gained favor and became an important servant. However, he was falsely accused of a crime he did not commit by Potiphar's wife and was thrown into prison. Once again, Joseph's life seemed to be filled with setbacks, and each new chapter appeared to be another opportunity lost. But Joseph did not lose hope or abandon his faith. He continued to trust that God had a purpose for his life, even in the most unjust and trying of circumstances. While Joseph was in prison, he encountered two officials from Pharaoh's court, a cupbearer and a baker, who had fallen out of favor with the king. Joseph interpreted their dreams and in turn asked them to remember him when they were restored to their positions. Yet when the cupbearer was released and restored to Pharaoh's service, he forgot about Joseph for another 2 years. Once again, Joseph's opportunity for freedom and vindication seemed to slip away. However, during this time of waiting, Joseph did not lose his trust in God's sovereignty, and eventually his patience and faith were rewarded. Pharaoh had a troubling dream, and none of his advisors could interpret it. It was then that the cupbearer remembered Joseph and told Pharaoh about the young man in prison who had correctly interpreted his own dream. Joseph was summoned from prison to stand before Pharaoh, and by the power of God, he interpreted Pharaoh's dream, warning of a coming famine. Joseph's wisdom and insight earned him a position of great authority in Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself. In one moment, Joseph went from a prisoner to a ruler, from a man of despair to a man of power. What seemed like a series of lost opportunities and painful detours was actually God's perfect timing unfolding. Joseph could never have imagined that his years of suffering and hardship were preparing him for this moment, where he would not only save Egypt from famine, but also reunite with his family and see God's promise fulfilled. Joseph's story teaches us a vital lesson about trusting in God's sovereignty. Even when we don't understand why things are happening the way they are, we must believe that God has a purpose. He is not caught off guard by our circumstances. Even in the most difficult times, He is working behind the scenes, orchestrating events and aligning circumstances to bring about His plan for our lives. We may not see the full picture, but God does. It is weaving a story that is far greater than we can imagine. And every chapter, no matter how painful, is part of His divine narrative. Joseph's life also shows us that God's sovereignty doesn't mean that life will be free from pain or hardship. In fact, God often uses seasons of struggle to shape us, refine our character, and prepare us for greater things. Joseph's time in the pit, his years in slavery, and his time in prison were not wasted. They were times of preparation. Through these experiences, Joseph grew in wisdom, humility, and faith. He learned to trust God more deeply, to rely on God's timing, and to remain faithful even when circumstances were bleak. When the opportunity came, he was ready, equipped, and prepared for the great responsibility that lay ahead. In our own lives, we too will face seasons of struggle, loss, and uncertainty. We may experience betrayals, delays, or injustices that leave us wondering where God is in the midst of our pain. But just as Joseph trusted in God's sovereignty, we are called to do the same. Trusting God's sovereignty means believing that even when we don't understand our circumstances, God is still in control. It means recognizing that our pain is not pointless, that God can use our struggles to refine us and prepare us for what He has planned. It also means acknowledging that God's timing is perfect. Just because things aren't happening according to our timeline doesn't mean that God is not working. He is always at work behind the scenes, preparing us, guiding us, and positioning us for what lies ahead. And when the time is right, He will open the door to the opportunity we've been waiting for. Joseph's life is a powerful reminder that God's sovereignty doesn't always look the way we expect. His ways are higher than our ways, and His plans are greater than our plans. But when we trust Him, even in the most difficult seasons, we can rest in the assurance that He is working everything out for our good and His glory. What may seem like lost opportunities are actually the stepping stones to a greater purpose that God is preparing us for. We may not see it now, but in time we will look back and see how God used every trial, every setback, and every moment of suffering to bring us to a place of greater blessing, purpose, and fulfillment. So when life doesn't make sense, when opportunities seem to slip away, and when you feel overwhelmed by your circumstances, remember Joseph. Remember that God's sovereignty is not dependent on what we can see or understand. It's rooted in the truth that He is always in control, always working for our good, and always preparing us for something greater. Trust His timing, trust His process, and trust that He is with you every step of the way. Restoration is a concept that many of us can relate to, especially when we experience the pain of loss. Whether it's the loss of a relationship, a job, a dream, or a season of life we thought would last forever, the natural human response is to want to return to the way things were before the loss occurred. We long for things to go back to the way they were, to reclaim what has been taken from us, or to undo the mistakes and missteps that led to our current state. We believe that restoration means getting exactly what was lost, as if the past can be perfectly replicated. However, God's restoration doesn't always follow our expectations. Often it's much greater, more profound, and more aligned with His ultimate plan for our lives. One of the most beautiful examples of this truth is the story of Ruth in the Bible. Ruth was a woman who, like many of us, experienced devastating loss. She lost her husband, the person she had hoped to build her life with. To make matters worse, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, also faced the death of her husband and both of her sons, leaving her in a vulnerable position. Naomi decided to return to her homeland, and Ruth, though given the opportunity to stay in her own land, chose to follow Naomi, pledging her loyalty and faithfulness. It was an act of love and obedience, but also one of profound loss. Ruth left behind her family, her culture, and the life she had known to embark on a new journey, unsure of what awaited her. From a human perspective, Ruth's life looked bleak. She was a widow, an outsider in a foreign land with very little to offer. It's easy to see why she might have felt like her life was over, that her opportunities were gone, and that the restoration she might have hoped for was out of reach. But God, as He often does, had a plan for Ruth that was far greater than what she could have imagined. Through her obedience, faith, and willingness to step into the unknown, God worked a divine restoration that exceeded her expectations. Rather than returning to a life that resembled what she had lost, Ruth's obedience led her to a future that was far better than she could have ever envisioned. She met Boaz, a wealthy landowner who, through God's providence, was kind to her and provided for her needs. Eventually, Ruth and Boaz married, and they became the great-grandparents of King David, one of the most significant figures in Jewish history. Ruth's lineage became the lineage of Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world. What began as a story of loss and sorrow became a story of legacy, hope, and divine redemption. Ruth's restoration did not look anything like what she had lost. She did not get her first husband back. She did not return to the life she knew. Instead, she received something far greater, a new purpose, a new family, and a legacy that would impact generations to come. God's restoration is often like that. It doesn't simply return us to where we were before. It moves us forward into a new, often more fulfilling chapter of our lives. This is the essence of God's restoration. It is not just about regaining what was lost, but about embracing a new season that is richer, fuller, and more in line with His divine plan. Similarly, in our own lives, we may face seasons where we are deeply disappointed by the losses we've experienced. We might have hoped for a relationship that never came to fruition, a dream that was never realized, or a career that didn't take off. We may long for things to return to how they once were. And in that longing, we can miss the greater work that God is doing. His restoration often involves leading us into new opportunities, new relationships, and new callings that are far better than anything we could have imagined for ourselves. Consider the example of someone who has experienced a career setback. Perhaps they were passed over for a promotion they had been working towards for years, or their job was eliminated due to unforeseen circumstances. It's easy to assume that restoration means getting back to the position they once held, or even receiving that promotion in the future. However, God's restoration might not come in that form. It might look like a new job that aligns more closely with their true passions, or an unexpected opportunity to start their own business. It may not look like what they expected, but it will be more purposeful and fulfilling because it's in alignment with God's plan. Similarly, for those who have faced the loss of a relationship, whether through a breakup, divorce, or the death of a loved one, restoration may not mean simply finding another relationship that mirrors the one they lost. It may involve discovering a deeper sense of self, healing, and wholeness. It could mean becoming more engaged in other meaningful relationships, whether with family, friends, or a community, and finding fulfillment in ways that they hadn't previously imagined. God's restoration is not just about replacing the past, but about offering a new way forward that brings joy, purpose, and healing. The key to experiencing God's restoration is faith and trust. We must believe that God's plans for our lives are greater than our own. His vision for our future exceeds our ability to imagine it. When we place our trust in Him and surrender our desires to His will, we open ourselves to the kind of restoration that far exceeds what we think we need. God's restoration might not look like a return to what we had, but it will always be something better, something more aligned with the greater purpose He has designed for us. In the story of Ruth, we see that God was not simply restoring her to a life that was familiar to her. He was leading her to a place where her obedience, faith, and willingness to follow Him would create a legacy that would echo through generations. In the same way, God is not simply looking to restore what we have lost. He is leading us toward a future that is greater than we can comprehend. Our losses, heartaches, and disappointments are not in vain. They are part of the process that God uses to refine us and prepare us for something better. When we embrace God's restoration, we can let go of our own expectations of what that restoration should look like. We can trust that even if it doesn't come in the form we anticipate, it will always be more purposeful and fulfilling than we could ever imagine. Whether it's a new career, a new relationship, or a new sense of purpose, God's restoration always leads us toward a life that reflects His goodness, His grace, and His faithfulness. Restoration in God's hands is never about going backward. It's about moving forward into a greater and more fulfilling future. Just as Ruth's story turned from loss to legacy, so too can our lives be transformed through God's divine restoration. His plans for us are always good, and His restoration is always greater than anything we could have expected. One of the most common traps that many of us fall into, especially after experiencing disappointment, loss, or missed opportunities, is the victim mentality. It's easy to adopt a mindset where we see ourselves as victims of circumstances, where we define our lives by the opportunities we've missed or the mistakes we've made. This kind of thinking can become all-consuming, keeping us stuck in a place of bitterness, resentment, and hopelessness. We become so focused on the past, on what could have been, that we lose sight of the future and the potential for redemption and restoration that lies ahead. The reality, however, is that we are not defined by our past mistakes, mischances, or failures. Our lives are not a reflection of our shortcomings, but rather a testimony to God's grace and His ability to bring good from even the most painful situations. Yes, we may have missed opportunities, experienced setbacks, or made decisions we now regret, but these things do not have to dictate the course of our lives. The power of God's grace is that it redeems our failures and turns them into stepping stones toward a greater purpose. When we embrace the victim mentality, we essentially give power to the things that have hurt us. We start to view ourselves as helpless victims of our circumstances, convinced that there is nothing we can do to change our situation. This mindset can paralyze us, preventing us from taking the necessary steps to move forward. It's a mindset that thrives on defeat, looking back rather than forward, and it keeps us tethered to a past that cannot be undone. However, God's grace invites us to let go of that mentality and embrace a new perspective. Instead of allowing our past failures or missed opportunities to define us, we can allow God to redefine us. He is the God who makes all things new. His redemptive power takes what was meant for harm and uses it for good. The moment we choose to let go of the victim mentality, we open ourselves up to the possibility of restoration, growth, and new opportunities. In 2 Corinthians 5:17, the Bible says, "Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old has gone, the new is here." This verse is a powerful reminder that we do not have to live under the weight of our past. We are not stuck in the mistakes we've made, nor do we have to be defined by the opportunities we missed. Through Christ, we are made new, and the old things, our failures, our regrets, our perceived losses, are gone. God's grace transforms us and makes us capable of stepping into a future filled with hope and new possibilities. Letting go of the victim mentality doesn't mean ignoring the pain or pretending that our struggles haven't mattered. Grieving over lost opportunities or past mistakes is natural and healthy. It's important to acknowledge our pain and give ourselves permission to feel the weight of the losses we've experienced. However, it's equally important not to let those feelings become the lens through which we view our entire life. If we continue to see ourselves as victims, we're choosing to live in a narrative of defeat, and we are robbing ourselves of the opportunities for healing and restoration that God wants to bring into our lives. God's grace is not just about forgiveness. It's about transformation. It's about taking the broken pieces of our lives, whether they be from poor decisions, failed relationships, or lost opportunities, and allowing God to put them back together in a way that brings about something beautiful. His grace doesn't just cover our past mistakes, it empowers us to move forward into a future that is brighter and more purposeful than we could have ever imagined. The story of the Apostle Paul provides a profound example of this truth. Before becoming one of the most influential leaders in the early church, Paul, then known as Saul, was a persecutor of Christians. He was responsible for imprisoning and even overseeing the deaths of believers in Jesus. If anyone had reason to see themselves as a victim of their past mistakes, it was Paul. He had caused immense harm, and his actions had led to the suffering of many innocent people. Yet when Paul encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus, his life was radically transformed. God didn't see him as a victim of his past. Instead, God saw the potential for redemption and restoration. Paul became one of the most passionate advocates for Christ, spreading the